the pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Mia Bloom. So Dr. Bloom is the International Security Fellow at the New America and a professor at Georgia State University. Bloom conducts research in Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia and speaks 8 languages. She's the author of 6 books and over 70 articles on violent extremism, including Dying to Kill, The Allure of Suicide Terror, Living Together After Ethnic Killing, Bombshell, Women in Terror, and Small Arms, Children and Terror, and Pastels and Pedophiles Inside the Mind of QAnon with Sofia Moskalenko. Our next book, Veiled Threats, Women and Jihad, is expected in 2023. Dr. Bloom is a former team member of the Council on Foreign Relations and has held appointments at Cornell, Harvard, Princeton, and McGill universities. She serves on the counter-radicalization boards of the Anti-Defamation League, the UN Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, and Women Without Borders. Dr. Bloom has a PhD in political science from Columbia University, master's in Arab studies from Georgetown, and bachelor's in Russian, Islamic, and Middle Eastern studies from McGill, and a pre-doctorate from Harvard Center for International Studies, and postdoctorate from Princeton University. And I can tell you, this is the most attendance we have ever received for the working group meeting. So again, we are very pleased to have Dr. Bloom with us, and I will turn it over to Dr. Bloom, and we are anxiously waiting to hear from you.
Dr. Bloom, I think you might be muted.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, that's perfect.
So I started with the kind introduction, and his presentation that I gave to the Brims keynote for Kathleen Carley, I guess it was about a little over a year ago. I noticed that a lot of the people, as you introduced yourselves, you computer science or information science, and I'm political science, so this is going to be a little bit different. But then the other thing is to keep in mind that as we move forward, we have to understand how each of these different fields feed off of one each other and cross-pollinate. So there might be one slide that for you is laughable because sometimes I present this to non-computer science and non-information science people. So I have to explain what AI is, but hopefully the revelation is new, interesting. So I introduced my research. The reason I put this up is to remember my research funded for the last 13 years by the Office of Naval Research. So I have to give you a disclaimer that any mistakes I make are my own, and that I do not represent the position of the military or of the Navy. I noticed in the chat that my voice apparently is coming strangely across, and I switched to a hotspot that my Wi-Fi was not very.
It's mainly distorted. Maybe Dr. Bloom, if you could move your computer to maybe a stronger Wi-Fi signal. Could that be the reason?
What I'm telling you is that's why I moved off of Wi-Fi because it was using my phone as a hotspot, and my phone is next to the.
Yeah, so Simon has a good suggestion. Let's turn off the camera and see if that saves some bandwidth.
Okay. Well, what I'll do is I'll stop my video and then just share the screen.
Let's try that.
Okay. And you can hear me fine now?
Yes.
All right. So my disclaimer is that I don't represent the US government or the Department of the Navy, even though this research is funded by the Navy and the Office of Naval Research and Minerva, but I have to make that very clear. All right, the next. So here's a sample books that Nitin was kind enough to mention, and I'm just waiting to hear on the new book. And I've already pitched the next book, for something a little different, to look at state terrorism, because a lot of research has been done on non-state actors, but no one has said the country perpetrate terrorism against their civilians. I will be extremely unpopular with the next book. Let me talk a little bit about online extremism. There has been a massive focus on the online space, the virtual spaces in which people are either lured into radical groups or are perhaps further radicalized. So the problem is that there's been an overabundance of on jihadi extremism, and very much at the neglect of the far right. The other thing that's been problematic, aside from the overemphasis on Islamic, fundamentalism or terrorism, despite the fact that we know from the data, for example, from New America, or ADL, and other sources, that 75% of the terrorist attacks in the United States since 9/11 have been far-right domestic groups and not jihadi groups. But when you look at the literature, and also when you look at the way the funding has been structured, there has been an over-reliance on looking at this one group. And I think it's one of the reasons why, for example, the country was unprepared for January 6th, because either people were unaware or refused to acknowledge that so much of the domestic extremism was coming from within these far-right echo chambers. The thing I noticed as I was studying jihadi groups, in particular looking at their social media and their online recruitment strategies, was that they became very adept at propaganda. You would have massive global penetration of a message through social media like Facebook or Twitter. Here is an example in 2014, I think it was July, where Khalid Sharoof, who was an Australian jihadi, who stole his brother's passport and he went to join ISIS along with his 5 children, posted an image of his, at the time, 9-year-old son holding a severed head. Well, it wasn't long on Twitter before it was there. In terms of the traditional print media, the same image appeared, and not only on print media, also television media. So within 24 hours, this one image, it cross-cut. It was Australia, you see here from CNN, it was in the US, it was in the UK, it was in Canada. And so as a result, I think many of these groups realize the value of social media in penetrating, all corners of the earth and disseminating their message. The other thing that Telegram, which is a semi-encrypted platform, as you guys know that, became the platform of choice for ISIS. And so what happened was there was tens of thousands of propaganda posts on Telegram. And this was particularly the case after December of 2015, January 2016, when many of the social media companies based in Silicon Valley clamped down on jihadi material. So for example, Twitter, Facebook, Google, YouTube, all of them were instructed to shut down as quickly as possible any kind of content, whereas Telegram remained a venue for these groups up until late 2019. So in other words, when you hear Facebook or Twitter or Google now say it's impossible to rid the platform of hate speech or this particular terrorist group, we know that's not true, because they were very, very able to do it for the jihadi groups. Again, despite having very Arabic language speakers. But one of the things I was able to observe, this was a Minerva Award, was that there are different kinds of things that they were posting. And so a lot of this is very much from like the psychology experiments of B.F. Skinner, that they very
Did we lose Dr. Bloom?
Yeah, I don't hear anything.
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Bloom, are you with us?
I am.
So
So what they
okay.
were able to
Here is a suggestion. How about we have Chris present your slides, because I believe screen sharing is also adding load or stress to the bandwidth.
Okay, Chris, do you know what page we're on?
Yeah. Give me 1 second here to pull it up. Let's see. Let me know.
So I
It could be a
stopped
Zoom
sharing.
glitch today. Yeah.
Was
All right.
this slide 5? Is that right?
It's go down to slide 9.
9. Sorry. There we go. All right. Can y'all
And
see that?
go-
Okay.
Sure, and go
Mhm.
full screen. Okay, so what we were able to do was examine the Telegram channels. And of course, the material that ISIS was posting was being posted in something like 25 or 26 different languages. And so we were, at one and the same time, we were able to observe the differences between what was being said in Arabic, what was being said in French, Russian, English, but also there were certain behavioral elements that we were able to observe that all became very relevant for understanding how the social media online space was being used to recruit and retain followers. Next slide, please. So in the chat room, so this is a true story, an interesting one. So, you know, when I originally wrote this proposal, I had an assistant who was an Arabic speaker, and then they left. And so my Arabic was a little bit rusty. I hadn't studied Arabic since the 90s. So at a certain point, having to do this project, I was collecting things that were not strictly channels, because the proposal was to collect from the official channels. We ended up getting a lot of chats, but in getting the chats, we got additional sources of data and information. For example, we could identify key nodes within the network, and this is very much influenced from Kathleen Carley's work on dynamic social networks, to see the role played by individual administrators. So here is a sampling, for example, 6 of a guy that he went by the name Shaduk. We found out accidentally once his name is Mustafa. And Mustafa, he stopped posting in 2019. But what was interesting was not just what he was posting, but the rules of the room. So very often, as you see, sort of, for those of you who can read it, it basically, it's, you know, it says no women and no fitna. And in other words, the argument was, if you're going to be in a chat room, you couldn't argue against the points people were making. And they were very concerned about people like me, lurkers, but also that was important to know, because some of the arguments in counterterrorism have been, you can engage people, talk to them, and make them go off ramping so that they leave terrorism, and they can still be upset about whatever underlying grievance, but you move them off the platform. What they did in these chats is they made sure a priori that could not happen. And so the moment you tried to engage someone and challenge a point that was being made, you were kicked off. And so they policed the platforms quite rigorously. They were looking for researchers. They were looking for infiltrations by security officials. The other things that happened both with the channels and chats is you had 30 minutes to link to it. So let's say you'd be on Telegram channel, you know, Khilafa al-Islamiyya, and they advertised a new channel. If you didn't click on it within 30 minutes, you lost access to the channel. And what that actually ended up doing is it sustained user engagement, because no one wanted to leave for fear that there would be something that they couldn't link to that had expired. Next graph, please. The chat rooms and the channels employed a lot of, you know, visually attractive materials. One of the things is that they understood very well that they had different constituencies to which they needed to appeal. So the 18 to 30 male group, very often gamers or people who played Call of Duty, could relate to these memes. So instead of Call of Duty, it was Call of Jihad, or it was, you know, Call of Jihad, respawn in Jannah, in heaven. Respawn meaning your new life for the gamers, people who aren't gamers in the room. So a lot of this was centered around this notion of different kinds of what we would call not push factors about grievances, but pull factors, things that people benefited from. And so they pushed this idea of belonging, brotherhood, and jihadi cool. And you'll see that out of King's College in London, Rafi Pantucci talks about from zero to hero. In other words, people who were feeling like their lives were not particularly valuable, now this gave them the chance to do something really great. Next slide, please. So by fostering this FOMO, this fear of missing out, what it meant is that people began to disconnect from their real lives to basically exist almost 100% online. So they stopped getting together with their friends because, you know, they might miss something on the channels, but also there was a certain amount of psychological dependence that was being fostered. So for example, if, let's say just as an example of Haider wanted, you know, had a question or looked at the group, all of a sudden now on his Facebook, he would have 100 new friend requests. On his Twitter, he would have 500 new followers. It was a kind of love bombing, but in the virtual space. And in doing so, people became very dependent emotionally on the validation that they were getting in these online spaces. And again, what this does is it's exploiting the individual, you know, anomie or isolation. As you can imagine, we understand that better now after 2.5 years of pandemic. But, you know, when we were doing this research in 2017, 2019, we didn't realize how lonely and isolated and dependent online people were. And so again, this variable schedule of reinforcement, which is a psychological term from B.F. Skinner, was that it wasn't always the same content. The content varied, so you didn't lose interest. Sometimes it was a meme, sometimes it was a nasheed, a sort of a musical prayer. Sometimes it was a GIF, like in other words, lots of different things so that you never really got bored. Next slide, please. So one of the things that happened, again, completely by accident, is that we managed to, because we were in the chats, and obviously I wasn't under my real name, we were able to see certain things in the planning stages, reported them to relevant security agencies, and these things were the things that were prevented. And so in essence, the government was very excited for its very, very small amount of research money for this project. We were actually able to prevent a lot of things, you know, the dogs that didn't bark. Next slide. So it's, you know, it's conceivable that you think, okay, well, there's a lot of boasting and bullshitting that's online. And we know this from posts, but, you know, at least in 2 of the instances, this is the one against Prince George, the individual was arrested and is now in jail. So we know that not all the things that we saw and reported were just empty boasts. Some of them were actual plans in various stages of completion. Next slide. Okay, now I know who I'm talking to, so I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but because we had tens of thousands of images and, you know, human annotators could do only so much, one of the things working with my computer science grad student, Bash, we used, you know, very basic machine learning in order to go through the materials and teach the computer how to see the image the way the human eye sees it. And again, I know this might be very redundant for you all, but for example, the image thesauri that exists for machine learning tends to be beautifully lit, centered pictures with no distortion or noise, whereas images in real life are not that way. You know, like the Coke can, let's say for instance, for AI, you said Coke can, you're going to get a beautifully lit Coke can against a backdrop of nothing, right? And it's not going to be dirty. There isn't going to be, you know, a partial view. Now, the human eye can see a Coke can, the back of the can or the side of the can, and recognize it as a Coke can, in part because that's how our brains function. We, you know, when there's missing data, the brain fills it in. The computer really wasn't initially able to do that. So with every iteration of the machine learning, the computer's ability to recognize a person, a gun, a truck got better. And again, this is other thing in the thesaurus, you don't have images with multiple things in it. So in doing so, we were developing a kind of algorithm for machine learning that was a little bit more sophisticated and more reflective of real world imagery. Next slide, please. So for example, we created the documenting the virtual platform so that you could do searches, and you see, you can check off a box and say, I'm looking for all the assault rifles, or I'm looking for all the beheadings. And then what happens is you get a selection of images, you click on, you get the image. But then, you know, we live in 2022, well, at the time, 2020, and we had to put in something like, okay, what if we need trigger warnings? So you could tick off that you don't want to see violent content. Next slide. So in the next slide, you have the exact same image, but we took out the blood. So you don't see the bloody body. Now, how did we teach a computer to recognize like a mass casualty event or a genocide or something like this? We came up with an idea. We told the computer, look for someone lying down and red. And in fact, just that very basic instruction was able to allow the computer AI algorithm to go through the tens of thousands of images to find images of these executions and genocide or mass casualty events very effectively, in part because the UN is thinking maybe to charge ISIS with war crimes and crimes against humanity. And a lot of this material is no longer available because remember I said that eventually Telegram did take everything down. But so we had a repository of all the images. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to go into this, but you have to understand when I'm talking to political scientists, I have to explain what machine learning is. So I'm going to assume that you guys know the difference between supervised and unsupervised, but also that was to explain why we had boxes in terms of the grouping of objects. And then, as you know, with every iteration, every cycle through it, the algorithm gets better. And so I think we didn't get up to industry standard of 93%, but we got very close. We got up to 89% in terms of accuracy. And, you know, if we decide to move forward with the project, there's more sophisticated tools now 2 years later that can be applied. But in essence, this was a very useful tool to be able to improve the quality of machine learning, but also the caveats about the fact that these thesauri are imperfect because real world doesn't happen well lit without any kind of noise or occlusions. Next slide, please. So the information online was used to instill fear and radicalize others. But one of the things that we started to notice with ISIS is that there was a lot of what we would now call fake news. So, for example, they took credit for the Las Vegas attack that killed 53 people, despite the fact that Stephen Paddock, this is the gentleman here, was not a Muslim and not perpetrating this for ISIS. Oddly enough, we still don't know what motivated him, but it was interesting that ISIS was no longer able to project its power and carry out efficient attacks. And so they just took claim of any attack or anything bad that happened. They were rushing to claim it as one of theirs. Next slide. How do we know that they were full of doo-doo? Well, so this is one of the infographics that AMOC, which is their information agency, or like their AP or their Reuters. So they were advertising all these attacks that they had perpetrated, including, you know, San Bernardino and including the Pulse nightclub, except for the fact that they have San Bernardino and Orlando both in Florida. And I'm thinking, if you don't know where San Bernardino is, you probably did not plan that attack. But these were the people who claimed to have been inspired by ISIS. And so ISIS was like, sure, we'll take it. Now you compare that, for example, to Paris or Brussels or Dhaka, Bangladesh, and on the platforms in Telegram, they had GoPro cameras and you could see in real time them carrying out the attack. Whereas, you know, falsely claiming responsibility for attacks was very obviously different from the ones that they had planned and carried out because they were presented differently on the platforms. But, you know, again, not to be sarcastic, but if you don't know that San Bernardino is California and you think it's in Florida, you didn't plan that attack. Next slide, please. And so a lot of the methodology that I'd used to track ISIS, we started looking at QAnon at the beginning of 2018. I was asked by NSF and a number of people, could I explain what was going on with QAnon? And just for those of you who have not heard it, QAnon is this, next slide, this baseless conspiracy theory that has become extremely popular in the United States and in Canada, but also in places like Australia, Germany, Britain, even as far as Indonesia. And so it's a wide-ranging baseless conspiracy theory that claims that there's an elite group, this quote unquote cabal, or as our Congressperson Marjorie Taylor Greene calls it, a cabal of elites, Democrats, and others who are trafficking in children, that they are sexually abusing the children and drinking their blood. And they explain all the different things that they use with this blood, but that this elite has been ruling the world since time immemorial, and that Donald Trump, however, was elected to stop them. Next slide. So this is the basis, Democrats, Hollywood celebrities, even the royal family, and some notable even Republicans, that there was a secret plan. By the way, this is complete bunk, but I have to explain what they think. What we started to see in March of 2020 was spikes in QAnon activity that corresponded with the lockdowns and the stay-home measures. And so they're very intimately connected to the pandemic in terms of its popularity. Next slide, please. QAnon was pretty much a fringe conspiracy until the pandemic. And a lot of what's in QAnon would be familiar to people who study, for example, anti-Semitism, because, a global cabal that is manipulating things, that is also part of some of the anti-Semitic lore, as well as something called a blood libel, which makes the argument that Jews take the blood of unbaptized babies in order to make their ceremonial foods at Passover. This is around Easter. One of the things that was very clear is that the QAnon ideology echoes and resonates very closely with what is from 1905. This was a fabrication by the Russian secret police under the Tsar, called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, this book has been translated to 85 different languages. You can walk into any bookstore in Cairo and get the Arabic version. It is still one of the most popular books ever published. Despite the fact that we know that it's a fabrication and it's baseless, it has still, been very popular for a long time. In the early 1900s, around 1908 or 9, Henry Ford of Ford Motors had the book translated into English and circulated it in the United States. And so when you look at some of the ideology of the extreme far right, you see also a lot of this anti-Semitism and these arguments about the use of blood, babies, and controlling the world in this secret cabal. Next slide, please. So if you look at COVID, if you look at the COVID pandemic and you look at QAnon activity, you see from its outset in October 2017, when the first Q posts dropped, and they call them Q drops. The first one said that Hillary Clinton was about to be arrested. Obviously, she was not. There's over 4,500 of these Q drops between the period of October 2017 until the US election. And then after the 2020 election, QAnon went silent and just reemerged last month in terms of Q drops. But you see that the massive uptick with the pandemic and the lockdowns, it went from being a very flat curve to a very sharp one, to the extent that if the surveys are representative samples, we're looking at as many as 30 million American adults believe in the crazy thing that I just told you about. And part of the way that they were able to become so popular was that they used different hashtags to recruit or to target groups that previously were never targeted by extremism. So this included, the left-wing yoga moms and women on the far left, including women on the far right. And so by using this hashtag, which is named after a real charity, Save the Children, it really helped them move away from sort of the semi-encrypted platforms of 4chan, 8chan, 8kun onto things like Facebook and Instagram, thus making it much more popular and influencing more people. Next slide, please. And so according to the Wall Street Journal, it was a 600% increase with the COVID-19 lockdowns. Next slide. Here's where it gets interesting in here, so here's why Mia became interested. As early as 2019, Christopher Wray of the FBI basically said that QAnon had the potential to be a domestic terrorist threat. This has been reiterated in 2021 by Merrick Garland and by the head of Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. So Sophia and I, so Dr. Moskalenko and I, who have spent our entire careers studying radicalization and terrorism, thought, oh, well, let's look at QAnon, from the vantage point of two people who understand terrorism and radicalization fairly well. And what we found is from 2018 to 2020, there were 12 incidents, half of which were perpetrated by women, but there was only one that might have even, met the bar as being a potential terrorist threat. That's when the Hoover Dam was threatened. Some guy threatened to blow up the Hoover Dam with a van full of explosives. And because that's an infrastructure, that's why it would qualify as a terrorist attack. But most of the other stuff was highly personal, parents killing their own children because they thought that they had serpentine DNA, or women kidnapping their own kids when they lost custody. So most of the crimes that were perpetrated would be very interpersonal in nature. Next slide, please. The other thing was very intimately connected with Republicans and with President Trump. So for example, starting in October of 2018, so it's been around for a year, you start seeing Q signs and QAnon people showing up at Trump rallies. This is one here. You can see it's with Governor DeSantis in Florida. I think this would have been in Orlando. Next slide, please. And when you looked at the primary 2 years ago in the summer of 2020, there were 97 different candidates who were basing their platforms with QAnon. I don't know if we want to call it an ideology, but basically they were 97 QAnon candidates. Of the 97, 24 won their primaries and went on to the November election. 22 of those were Republicans, 2 were independents, like very strong supporters of Bernie Sanders. And in the election of 2020, only 2 won. And they've become quite infamous now, Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Interestingly enough, we've seen in the last primary, more QAnon people have won. For example, Doug Mastriano, who is going to be running for, governor of Pennsylvania. He supports this QAnon. So we've had, although there's 2 official in Congress, there are a lot more who are also very QAnon friendly, everyone from Mo Brooks to Matt Gaetz. Next slide, please. And because it was very political, I've had to be very careful, since again, this is funded by the DoD, to make clear that, they're using, I don't know who's using whom. They're either using the Republican Party in order to gain power for their individuals like Greene and Boebert, or the Republican Party sees them as useful idiots, and so they don't want to disavow the QAnon claims, despite the fact that initially people like Kevin McCarthy was very anti Marjorie Taylor Greene, but because they won, they can't say anything, and they understand very clearly that if an important chunk in their base believes this crazy conspiracy. Next slide, please. The other concern was the extent to which people in the military and separately law enforcement believed in it. And the reason I mention this is partly because in July of 2020, so for July 4th, Michael Flynn, the disgraced former lieutenant general, basically uploaded a video of him and his family pledging allegiance to QAnon. And if you're familiar at all with ISIS, you know, this was one of the things that people would do for ISIS, for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is that they would, you know, make a pledge of allegiance. And so they were doing the same thing. But there was a concern. Now, again, fast forward, we didn't know this until post January 6, 2021. But when you look at the arrests around J6, 20% are either active or retired military. So the military and law enforcement clearly have been infiltrated. But the reason that this is important is the caveat to what Mayorkas and Christopher Wray was saying about the potential for terrorism. My argument instead is that if someone is a US military trained individual and believes in QAnon, the part that makes them dangerous is the US military training, not the belief in the blood drinking cabal. But if you combine that, or if you have intersectionality between QAnon and Proud Boys, or QAnon and Patriot Front, QAnon and KKK, QAnon and Three Percenters, those are the people who were most dangerous. And those were the people, for example, with the zip ties at the Capitol on January 6th. Next slide, please. What we did was we looked at from, you know, before the parlay was taken off of Amazon web hosting, we looked at uploads of videos of what people did on January 6th and cross-tabbed that with the location of military bases. And each of those red dots are military bases that uploaded videos of themselves from January 6th. So the military is a little bit reticent to acknowledge that there is a serious problem. It's not just the people who were arrested, because that's 20%, but it's the people who were sharing this content. And as a result of this research that I've done for Minerva, in the last statement by General Austin, they've now amended rules of the military and rules of engagement. You're no longer allowed to share social media that would be considered unpatriotic, or you're no longer allowed to post racist materials. Like all of the stuff that previously was protected now falls under the category of forbidden in the US military. So next slide. Social media finally clamped down in advance of the election. Now it's worth mentioning that Reddit, which was one of the earlier venues for QAnon, like they had Reddit threads like Calm Before the Storm or The Coming Storm, this thing with Storm, that's sort of also part of the ideology. They took QAnon materials down in 2018, but it took 2 years for Facebook, Twitter, Google, and so on to do it. And it was, as we know, from her name is Frances Howland's testimony before Congress, that those filters were taken off after the election. And so we saw the danger of January 6th, but from about the summer of 2020 until right after the election, those safety filters were actively working to either deplatform QAnon influencers or to limit the influence of that material. Next slide, please. And so you see Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, even Etsy. And this is all from the summer of 2020. Next slide. Interestingly enough, just like ISIS, after the deplatforming, QAnon supporters were instructed to change the way that they posted. So what ISIS was, people who followed ISIS, they were told, well, don't put ISIS, put I5, I5. So people understand that it looks like ISIS, but it's not. Or they were told, for example, with QAnon, put 17 anon because Q is a 17th letter, or misspell. And a lot of these efforts at camouflage were things that we saw ISIS doing in 2016. So, some of these tactics cross-cut group. Next slide, please. A lot of the QAnon materials were sold on Etsy or Amazon. They stopped doing that, but there was definitely a profit motive, and we can't disaggregate these conspiracies from the grift associated with it. Next slide, please. And this is what I'm talking about with the intersectionality, with the overlap. There's an overlap between the people who believed in QAnon, who were anti-vaccine, anti-5G, anti-mask. They were participating in Stop the Steal. And so QAnon beliefs can be held at the same time with other adjacent conspiracy beliefs in the fact that the government is overreaching its authority. And so this is the don't tread on me sign, but instead of saying don't tread on me, the snake is in the shape of a Q, and it's the where we go one, we go all, which is their saying. Next slide. Now, this initially, December 25th, 2020, was assumed that the Nashville explosion across the street from the AT&T building was associated with QAnon. This was Christmas Day of 2020. And I've done some work with the Nashville FBI, and they actually think that Quinn was just nuts. And so this was not the case of QAnon terrorism. But of course, you can imagine everybody was waiting for QAnon terrorism. So when they saw somebody who was kind of nuts and believed in conspiracy theories, they said, aha. But this is, again, one of the things that we have to be cautious with, jumping to the conclusion when there's an event. Next slide, please. And J6 was, I think, what most people associate now with QAnon. This is a picture of Jacob Chansley. This is the QAnon shaman. He's in jail. He's the one that's been requesting organic vegan food. And you can see he's face painted. His body is covered in tattoos. Next slide. So he's easy to spot in a crowd, in other words. When you look at the tattoos, you start to see the right-wing extremism influence. These are all Nordic tattoos that are used by the far right, whether it's the Tree of Life or Thor's hammer. These are all images that the far right has adopted because the neo-Nazis think that they're direct descendants of the Vikings. I'm not going to get into, I don't have time to get into the fact that the Vikings were heavily influenced by Islam because they were trading in the Middle East well before anyone else. But that freaked them out when they found in a Viking tomb, it was like, it was a handicraft stitched, and the stitching said, La Allah, Allah, wa Muhammad Rasul Allah, and they freaked out that they found this in a Viking tomb. So you've got these white guys who think that the Vikings are like the preeminent white people, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that very much. Next slide. And they were easy to spot in the crowd. So, you know, because they're wearing a big Q on their chest. This guy's also in jail now. Next slide, please. The most famous person QAnon killed on January 6th was Ashley Babbitt. And what was interesting is that initially, Trump supporters said she was Antifa. But, you know, now they've turned around and they've made her a martyr for, you know, the far right and for Trump supporters. Next slide. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go quicker. Here's an example of the criminal charges that have been for QAnon arrests post January 6th. Next slide, because I'm going to have to finish quickly. This is where we get some of this data about if the samples are representative, that we're looking at, you know, 30 million adults. Interestingly enough, you see that post January 6th didn't actually diminish very much people's belief in QAnon. And so it's gone right back up. Next slide. And here I circled for the 6%. This is from the Washington Post and American Enterprises Institute, a conservative think tank. And you see 6% of the people that agree, because you don't say, are you QAnon? In the same way, you know, you don't say, are you ISIS? But you give the statement that Trump has been fighting a cabal of child sex traffickers that include Democrats and Hollywood elites. That's very obviously QAnon. And you saw that 29% of Republicans and even 6% of people who identified as Democrats said, yes, we believe that's true. Next slide. And when you look at the contagion across the world, this is all the places now that have QAnon groups. And so there were two things I found was interesting. It's spreading to places, let's say, throughout Latin and South America, despite the fact that QAnon is very obviously racist and talks about people of color in very negative ways. But the other thing that really amazed me, I was like, so the Middle East looks pretty inoculated. And so we have my colleague on the grant, Dr. Nelly Lahoud, who just wrote the book on the Bin Laden papers. She's going through all of the material in Arabic that's being posted on social media, and QAnon is not spreading there. And, we looked at things like pedophilia, or with a B, pedophilia, or hub al-atfal, loving of children, like all the different permutations that we could think of. And we did not find stuff in the Middle East. Next slide. But in the UK, it's gone rampant. And even though Pizzagate has been shown to be fake, and Edgar, who perpetrated Pizzagate, admits that it was fake. Pizzagate has come back up about this, pedophilia and pizza and all of these conspiracies. In summer of 2020, there were 10 different giant rallies in the UK. Next slide. And it's important that we understand what's unique about Q in terms of, there have always been conspiracy theories. And there were conspiracy theories in particular in the US after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But what QAnon has done unique to previous conspiracy theories is that it has embraced all of the other groups that say that the earth is flat, or that there's lizard people walking around, or that there are space lasers, Jewish space lasers. That was Marjorie Taylor Greene. But so what happens is QAnon has managed to bring together groups that previously were not really talking to each other in this umbrella. And I think I may have to skip to the end. How many more do we have?
I think there's 3 more.
Let me just end with this one then. What are we talking with Q countermeasures? Part of it is that we can't look at people who believe in Q as an undifferentiated mass. So Sophia broke it down into people who were diehards. With those people, there doesn't matter what you're going to say or what you're going to do. You have to manage your expectations. Nothing, they're kind of a lost cause. You can't help them. Maybe you can give them some benefit of mindfulness training. But then with the doubters, there were different shades of how much QAnon belief you had. So it wasn't like ISIS. It's not like in ISIS, if you believed in the Salafi ideology, it's not like, well, I believe in ISIS, but I like gay people. You were all or nothing. With QAnon, you had shades of degrees of how much of those giant conspiracies you believed in. So you might believe in the cabal, but you didn't think the earth was flat. So you could pick and choose. So in as much as the degrees of QAnon-ness was relevant, the degrees to which people doubted was relevant. And so we have different kind of treatments and interventions for different kinds of QAnon people who are trying to leave. And then finally, with the defectors, as we know with the problems of recidivism, if people leave a group, the pull to go back is very high. So you also have to deal with people who have left. I think I'm going to have to end it there because we're running out of time. What is the very, very last slide, Chris? Yeah, you don't need to see the books. Okay, so we're good. I can do an extra 5 minutes because the introductions and I kept falling off, but do we have any questions?
Yeah, very fascinating talk, Dr. Bloom. Thank you so much. I was also watching the chat and I don't see the questions there, but I think folks were holding on. Of course, I had one. This is all publicly available information. Now I'm curious how much information exists in the deep web or dark web sources, or even the fringe platforms. Your thoughts?
So we were originally going to be doing dark web, and that part of the project fell off with the dark web, in part because the program officer was much more interested in dealing with people who either believed in QAnon and getting their opinions, doing interviews or surveys or focus groups. And so originally we were going to be looking at the dark web as the venue for, let's say, for instance, someone who's radicalized in the open APIs and then starts chatting privately and semi-encrypted to join the group, but then purchasing of the material for a bomb or for something that they were going to do needed to be done on the dark web. And so we had this idea of moving from the open API to the dark web to show what the process of moving from an online radical view to an offline radical action looked like. But that project was not funded. So we're still interested in the dark web, but as I'm sure many of you guys know, that sometimes there's research you want to do, and then there's research that gets funded, and the research that gets funded is the research you can do.
That's very well said. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I think there is a question in the chat. Is there racism the reason why these things don't spread to the Middle East, or the Middle East strong anti-pedophilia stance that keeps them out?
Well, so my first reaction is mashallah, but okay, moving beyond that is to say that, the racism of QAnon was very much targeting African-American and brown people and not really talking about the Middle East. The reason we expected the Middle East to be vulnerable or fertile ground for QAnon recruitment was because the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is so popular in the Middle East. And so an ideology that encompassed that we assumed would resonate. And in fact, it did not. And I don't know if there might be something, within certain circles about false gods, or it might be connected to that. But certainly we've also seen, and this was one of the results of Nellie's study, is that we don't have as much vaccine disinformation in the Middle East as we do in the West. And so it might be connected to the last part, which is one of the happy outcomes of authoritarianism, that in most of the countries in the Middle East, they keep very strict controls on social media. So you can't just post anything. And so because of those strict controls, they're able to clamp down on disinformation about the vaccine, as well as disinformation about QAnon. But it's one of those things where we don't have an answer yet. So we're slowly but surely trying to go through it. If I showed you some of the images, and I'll send Chris the article that we published looking at the Save the Children campaign. When you look at Save the Children, the charity, it's 98% children of color. Like, you don't see white people. Occasionally you'll see Jennifer Garner. And it was funny because the coders were like, oh, we found a white person. I was like, guys, that's Jennifer Garner. She's an ambassador and an actress. Don't go, oh. But when you looked at the race of children who were in the QAnon Save the Children hashtag, they were 94% white. So the idea that QAnon is spreading is that they're coming after your white children. That was intended to activate white suburban Republican voters who were women, who had this reaction. And this harkens back to the time of Reconstruction, certain of these racial tropes that, there were black and brown men coming after your white girls. And so this really does activate these white suburban Republican women to come out and vote. And so more women voted in 2020 for Trump than in 2016, despite the grab them by the who's, all of that. Grab them by the kusti. I can say kusti because no one understands that except two people. But all of the stuff that he did really turned off Republican women. And we know that they didn't show up in 2018 for the midterms. But the hashtag campaign of Save the Children and QAnon propaganda really brought them back to the voting booths. So I'm hoping, the problem is it's spread in Latin and South America despite being racist against brown people. So we don't have that as an automatic answer. We're still looking, and we're not going to give up until we figure it out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Bloom. I know that we have some questions, more questions on the chat. And I'm also checking the time. Do you already had a hard stop at noon, or is it okay if we go a few minutes?
I can go
over?
2 more minutes, but I've got a 12:30 in State College. So what I would say, so the countries in red were countries that had Facebook groups for QAnon, but we didn't weight them for greater or lesser. This is for Gaurav's question. No, sorry, this is for Summer's question. So what I would say is that the Institute for Strategic Dialogue produces graphics of where there are the most QAnon. And so what happens is it's US, Canada, UK, Germany, Indonesia, Russia, and they keep changing the order, but it's always US, Canada, UK, and then the spots for 4 and 5 rotate in and out. But we didn't weight, we didn't do darker red and lighter red to show how much QAnon there was. And also the countries who have followers, yes, those are the countries, Gaurav, you're right, that have QAnon Facebook groups. And interestingly enough, QAnon is still, after those filters disappeared, QAnon has come back. And what we would have expected is that since none of those 4,000 500 plus. I guess it's almost I think it's up to 4,800 if the actual number is counted. None of them came true except one or two. And it was those one or two that allows it to continue to say, you see, we're right. So you could be wrong 4,000 times and be right one time, and they claim, accuracy. Some of the techniques to extract the social processes, what we're doing is we're combining the secondary research on Telegram of QAnon accounts and sort of the degree to which people are engaged and posting and consuming with surveys that are produced and they are distributed. And then we've got 2 or 3 psychologists that are going through the survey material to show degrees of radicalization. So basically, among the QAnon, we just published an article on the QAnon families, what's normally called QAnon casualties. But we're also looking at people who believe in QAnon and sort of what are the things that, give them pause. So for example, if Linwood from Georgia or some other famous person disavows QAnon, but is continuing to raise money off of it, is that disconnect going to cause the kind of departures that we've seen with terrorist groups? Or if we've, like, for example, there were 2 documentaries to track down who was Q, and it wasn't a military insider with clearance, it was some guy basically in his basement who owned or co-owned 8kun. That really didn't matter. Like, the identity of who QAnon was ceased to matter after the pandemic. So I think that it's become in some ways a mass movement, very hard to argue against. And so what we did in the book is, again, Sophia being a social psychologist and a clinical psychologist, we were able to provide people different ways, like, how do you deal with this if you have a friend or family member who's in QAnon? How do you get them out? And so what we had is very unusual for an academic book. We had at the back a series of questions where we give you the answers. You ask these questions to the person who believes in QAnon, and it chips away at their fundamental beliefs in a way that isn't antagonistic, but also some of the same tactics that Moonshot CVE has used, saying things like, we understand why you're upset. However, what do you think about this? And so, interestingly enough, a lot of people I've talked to have never heard of QAnon, but yet if the samples from AEI and Drury, the 2 surveys that I posted were representative, this is tens of millions of believers. That's far more than any terrorist group has ever seen. So, on the one hand, we would be very concerned if we thought QAnon was a terrorist group.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bloom, for sharing your fascinating work with the working group. And I'm sure there could be a lot more lines of inquiries, and please don't be surprised if you start receiving emails with those questions. And we look forward to having you at the SBP conference, which is going to be in the 3rd week of this month from 20th to 23rd September.
I wish I can, but in the 20th to 23rd, I'm going to be at other conferences. I have American Political Science and then the Northern CVE in Gothenburg, Sweden. So between the time difference and me traveling, I apologize that I'm going to have to miss it, but keep me in mind for the future, please.
Absolutely, will do. And thank you everyone for joining the working group meeting, and we will wrap this up, and we'll see you again next month with another fascinating speaker.